Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the War Report. Now, we have plenty of news to cover. I do have to report just at the top of the show, we're recording just moments after the China balloon got downed over the Atlantic Ocean. So, that is the context in which we're covering the show. Now, we'll talk about China balloon stuff later, because we have a lot to cover. A lot has happened on the front lines in Ukraine just over this past week. And there's been a lot of cascading effects from that, of course, especially with news out of Europe and what seems to be a general lack of enthusiasm to continue this conflict from all Western parties, I would say. Even the State Department, even the U.S., isn't sounding as fierce and ferocious as it did maybe even a year ago. And keep in mind, we're just shy of a year, just shy away from, just a few days shy away from the 1 year anniversary of the start of this war. That will be in a few weeks now, so that'll give us some interesting perspective to see how things look from a year out. It's certainly been a great deal of back and forth, much more than I think anyone would have really expected at the beginning of this conflict, but it seems like things are now starting to resemble what many anticipated would be the first few weeks of this. And without further ado, I'll hand it over to you to give us some more details on what
Yeah,
that might look like.
yes. A lot has been going on since last week. Um, Not necessarily in one area, but there was a major breakthrough. We, on our last show, discussed Soledar. However, it has been busy in the Bakhmut Soledar direction. Um, Sticking with Bakhmut, just today, the Russians have made advances inside Bakhmut to the south. This is north of Opotne, uh, um, where the Russians spent weeks and months trying to take Opotne. They already took that about 2 weeks ago, and now they're in the outskirts of the south. From the looks of it, they've taken about 4 or 5 blocks, including some um, grassy areas to the west of it. The other gains that the Russians have made is towards Ivanovskoye, which is just an area north of Kleshayevka. Now, the Russians took Kleshayevka about 2 weeks ago. It was a very hard going. What this has essentially done is given them the ability to reduce Ukraine to only one highway that goes in and out of Bakhmut that cannot be shelled. The two more southern east-west corridors going in and out of Bakhmut, one of them goes through Chasov, which is very close to Ivanovskoye. Um, they are under fire control, meaning if you want to cross, you might get shelled, you might get hit by an ATGM, you might not. You take your chances. But it is within cannon reach, and I would presume other types of artillery, uh, probably grad launchers and the such, because they are only about a few kilometers from inside the town there as well. But it's been a very, very hard fight for both sides, and I'm going to presume it's also been bloody for both sides. Now, um, just like literally an hour ago or less, I got news that the north part of Bakhmut, an area called Stupki, which is part of Bakhmut proper, it is south of Soledar. It has been taken over by the Russians, or Wagner to be more precise. This comes after Wagner began to encircle Krasnogora and move a little bit west and north again by taking Blagodatnoye. And from Blagodatnoye, they have actually increased their move northwards um, towards Seversk. Now Seversk, like they're getting very close to Seversk. I said on the show last week that they are about halfway. They're as close to Seversk now as they are to Bakhmut. So that's a very significant gain in the last 2, 3 weeks. Um, People have argued that this might be it. This could be like the beginning of the end or a retreat. Now, we don't like to prognosticate things prematurely on this show. Um, so I don't know. There are, of course, rumors that some of the best troops and foreign mercenaries have begun to leave Bakhmut, but I don't know. Um, I'll bring up another town that's in conflict right now, which is Ugledar in the south. This is part of Zelensky's line, which stretches all the way from Ugledar, goes around Donetsk city up to Bakhmut, and then terminates in Seversk. It's that Seversk Ugledar axis. Um, Last week there were all these forecasts that the Russians had already surrounded, they were in town, and like really within like a couple of days ago, there were people saying, I don't know where people got this information. We are not inside the town. We are shelling the town. We are on the periphery. We're attacking it from the southwest, the south, and the southeast and east, but we are not inside the town. It is slow going. The Ukrainians are still able to get reinforcements into that town, but it looks like, unlike the attacks on Zaporozhye, which have uh, stabilized, the Russians are not really advancing in any significant way, or not advancing at all in that area. And I guess Weeb Union was right that he did not believe. This was 2 weeks ago. He said he did not believe that this front was an actual offensive. It was to draw resources away from Bakhmut into another area that was very sensitive for the Ukrainians, and because essentially Kherson is impossible now, right? Like um, the Ukrainians cannot cross over and take over Kherson by crossing the river. So that leaves Zaporozhye as a contested ground, right? Um, but since Bakhmut has been made such a big deal, and Zelensky seems he is determined not to lose Bakhmut, it has dragged many forces away from Zaporozhye into Bakhmut town or city. It's a little city. I think it was like 75 or 80,000 before the war. I don't know if that includes Solidar and the other villages in and around it. And it's very close to Gorlovka, by the way. Like I don't know if it's even 30 kilometers from there. That's what I mean. Like people talk about these are small towns, but the thing is all these towns are separated by like 10, 20, 30, 40 kilometers of farmland, right? Like I can say the city that I live in, it was kind of like that. And then, 30 years later, it all amalgamated and it just became all concrete. So that's another way of sort of looking at it, is that there are many, many, many industrial urban pockets within this tapestry of farmland. So the Russians have been trying to draw away forces from Bakhmut by basically being very active on all the other fronts. Now, another big development that is happening right now or in the last 2 days, besides the Russians took another town in the north called Mikhailovka, which is really halfway between Seversk and Bakhmut. But they have also been very active in the Krasny Liman Kupiansk direction. They've made several gains in the last 2 days, and now they're closing in on Liman. There is a salient that is pushing towards Liman. This was the town that the Russians used to have, but gave up, I believe, at the end of September or early October. And the other interesting bit of news that I'm hearing is now, this is according to the Wall Street Journal, and they said, or it could have been, what is it, the Financial Times? It was one of those two. Said that the majority of the Russian forces with the T-90M breakthrough tanks these are the ones that have been given extra armor, are located north of the area of Kupiansk and the Oskol River. So they're not just forming in areas in southern Belarus on the border of Ukraine or around Belgorod or Sumy. They're actually now in this particular area, which would make sense, right? It would make sense that the Russians would want to push the Ukrainians on the west side of the Oskol River, the Oskol River being a natural boundary, which would mean that they would want to take Kupiansk, I would presume. Um, so the situation is in the north is very active. Again, the Russians took um, Belagorovka, but as I've said, this town has gone back and forth between the Russians and the Ukrainians. I'm not kidding. At least 4 times since this war started. Maybe this time I would say that they're more serious. There's really nothing left of the town anymore. It's absolute rubble, as is almost all the places where active fighting has been going on for a long time. Ugladar is turning into that. Um, it was a coal mining town which had a lot of high rises. Although the town is like really small, I think population 20, 30,000, it has a lot of apartment buildings, and that was basically to house all the coal miners in that area. So it makes taking it quite a bit more difficult. But the Ukrainians are very determined not to lose it. The only other place I'll say that there have been some gains, it appears, is Dibrova. I think the Russians either took it or took it back, according to the map that I'm looking at, and they've made some headway in the forest, the Sherwood Forest on the north side of the Severodonetsk River. So um, now there is talk about an evacuation taking place in Bakhmut. Um, Again, I stress this is just talk, but if you match it up with, I noticed Zelensky was talking about this, and he says, we will not surrender Bakhmut, right? We will stay as long as we can. This is at the clown EU show that was in Kiev yesterday, and Ursula von der Leyen was there, and so on. The acting president of the EU, and her husband, of course, who's an important CEO of Pfizer. It's just
Can't make it
unbelievable.
up. Can't make it
Yeah,
up.
nice to know. So um, that second part, as long as we can, doesn't sound right. Doesn't sound great. I think the fact that just today the Russians made grounds in taking some blocks in the south, and then for the first time, really taking the first blocks in the north of the city, in the district of Putki, um, might be a sign that something like a pullout is inevitable. Now, what they will probably do is they'll pull out the foreign fighters, right? Foreign fighters have been getting killed there regularly. There was, I believe, 1 or 2 Americans were killed this week. 2 Norwegians were wounded and are being flown back to Norway
And then there
via
was
Poland
also
for.
that one
Mm,
interview with that Australian mercenary,
yes.
which,
Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, that was. I haven't watched the full thing, but I did see the main part of it, and it
Yeah.
is an Australian mercenary who was fighting in Bakhmut, and he was discussing his confrontation, particularly with troops from the Wagner group. And what he had said is, despite some of the popular conceptions in Western media that these guys are just charging in human waves, that they're employing
Yeah.
old tactics from 1914, 1915, that it's actually anything but, that they are highly skilled fighters, that they are breaking through, and that it's hellish. He got into some of the supply line issues that, because of the corruption of both Western and the Ukrainian government, that by the time the supplies actually do get to the front lines, it's complete garbage at that point, and
Mhm.
is more or less it, they use it because that's all they have in terms of what it's actually worthwhile that's being scraped off the top, money's being scraped off the top, and then just the incoherent orders coming out of Kiev where they've put such draconian measures on how the interactions between commanding officers and the troops under them actually work, where there's really no room for flexibility, no room for any sort of questioning or dissent. I mean, obviously, in a military structure, it's not going to be. You're not going to have great debate over orders, but
There's not going to
it's
be peer reviews.
no, but it's the complete inflexibility is when it becomes a
Mhm.
problem, and at that point, it's gotten to that, and there's really no corrective measures for that. So on top of just facing a very competent opponent, particularly with the Wagner forces. He got into some of the other stuff about the other Russian forces, but he was referring particularly to his confrontation with Wagner around the Bakhmut area. Between that and the scraping off of the aid to the point where it is more or less, I wouldn't call it useless because it still is functional to a degree, but nowhere near what they have been promised or have had committed, and just the completely broken command structure is seeing a slow Ukrainian collapse. Now, I'm not saying, once again, I don't want to be a prognosticator, I don't want to be a doomsayer or anything, depending on, well, I suppose doomsaying depending on whatever your particular view on the war is, which I think everyone here is probably more or less in agreement with one another and with us. But with that out of the way, I don't see how this war effort, assuming this guy, and I have no reason to believe that he would lie, but I mean, people are very capable of making mistakes and misinterpreting situations. But taking this guy at his word, I see no way if this is how Ukraine's war effort as a whole is being conducted that this is sustainable to the point where the only way that this could end in Ukraine's favor, and this is a very big if considering the ramifications of these actions, is a full on world war with a direct NATO intervention, or if they
Yep.
do manage to rally countries like Poland, the Baltic states, Romania, Czech Republic, etc., into marching into that meat grinder as well, independent of NATO. So, that in terms of, I mean, this wasn't going to happen in the first place, but in terms of what on the surface was an independent Ukrainian victory, is completely gone to the point where it would take a massive intervention and a massive overhaul of Ukrainian forces in order to even get to a stalemate at this point. And
Right.
like I said, I'm not saying the Russians are going to win tomorrow, but looking at the trajectory of it, I can't say when it'll happen, but if things continue like they do, Russia will have a victory eventually, barring one of those events or another event such as maybe an internal crisis in Russia or maybe, again, just a variety of factors. But point being, if things continue on the current trajectory, there will be an eventual Russian victory in this war.
Right, and some of the narratives are already being set in place. Right, you have, of course, the ongoing ridiculous stories about human wave tactics, which they are not. And in fact, there's good scholarship now in World War II that there even then there were not human wave tactics in the way that they were in World War One, primarily because of tanks. But there are other reasons, and that the losses, the military losses, both for the Soviet Union and Germany, were about equal. Um, with the Russian military losing something like 500,000 more, um, from what I understand. I got this info from the Duran. I'm sure people can find it. In fact, a lot of the diaries that were written by the German generals in Stalingrad said that because it was a way to basically excuse themselves from a direct responsibility for the loss. And really, the direct responsibility for the loss was Hitler forcing them to stay there. Not so much them, because Paulus had been requesting that they remove the troops, or they would be killed off if they didn't. So um, to a degree, there was um, an evacuation from that area eventually, but there were still thousands that were trapped and lost in the city long after, for several months. or at least 1 or 2 months, as I remember, because I think Stalingrad was liberated on the 3rd of February.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Yeah, and these guys were still there in March, so um, something like close to 10,000. If I'm wrong, you guys can correct me, but there were several thousand that stayed behind. Um, in any case, yeah. So the Guardian came out with an article, and the really important part of the article was stating that suicide rates in the Ukrainian military have gone up. Um, there are severe numbers of losses. Even Podolyak confirmed that they are paying the highest price to keep Bakhmut just a day before the Guardian article. And um, the, uh, the the Guardian article also mentioned something that a lot of people have been discussing based on videos of guys being rounded on the street, whether it was in the Carpathian region where the Hungarians are, or Vinnytsia, or Kharkov, or
Well, I
Kiev,
was actually
or
just about to bring up that in regards to that footage. Now they've been doing this with a lot of their minority groups since the start of the war, especially the Hungarians. But now footage of Romanians in particular in the border
yes,
villages are being conscripted in large numbers.
that's right. That's right. And this has caused a row because Hungary essentially told Hungarians who are being rounded up to give up and surrender to the Russians as soon as possible. To which Ukraine demanded that Hungary be sanctioned right away. Um,
And I also did want to bring up in that same regard is that there's a complete media blackout in Romania, at least as far as I can find and as far as the people I know and trust I talk to about this even happening, and that there have actually been penalties in the past, now not legal, but just penalties from the actual media corporations of people who would go in the media and actually talk about this issue. So a complete media blackout there, which I mean, I suppose shows the deep roots that both the EU and NATO unfortunately have in a country like Romania as opposed to somewhere like Hungary, which really does show the difference because, once again, those are the two primary minority ethnic groups that would have those ties to their, I guess you could say, home countries, as it were. But other than that, I mean, and then, I mean, that's not even getting into the issue of like some of the stateless people, like the Rusins or the Ruthenian people, and I mean,
or the gypsies.
oh, yeah. I mean, this has been happening, once again to clarify, since the beginning of the war, but they have only intensified, and especially with the Hungarians, it has been. I can only describe it as a bloodlust from some of the videos I've seen because of Orban and the Hungarians' government reluctance to go along with whatever Ukraine demands, unlike most of the other Western nations or most of the other European Union nations, where it does seem like an ethnic vengeance the way they do treat the Hungarians and also the Hungarian troops when it comes to conscripting them. And
Yeah.
I can't say similar for Romania, although there has been some cries of dissent. For example, their defense minister was actually forced out of office because he had brought up something akin to that and had brought up something critical of the Ukrainian war effort. But when it comes particularly to the ethnic vengeance, you see that a lot when it comes to the conscripting of Hungarian diaspora in Ukraine.
Yeah. If you want a Romanian take on what's happening right now, he is the best weasel identifier in the world,
Beautiful,
and I'm
thank you, thank you.
yes, and I'm
Continue,
talking about
please.
Emil Kosman. Oh, this guy's so
Oh,
hilarious.
it's an amazing channel. This man puts out a good hour at least of content a day, and I would
Every half
certainly
hour, it's another
recommend.
video. And he always has a new shirt. Like he never wears the same shirt. And there'll be like 7 or 8 videos in one day between like 9 to 14 minutes long. It's a different shirt. People have commented he must have an incredible shirt collection. He does. But he is good. He is good. Um, yes, I do like him. Anyhow, um, yeah. So you can see some of this shifting. Last week we talked about the Rand report. This week CSIS uh, came out with their own report, and it very much parallels what the Rand report was saying, with a special emphasis on the looming threat of China, and also America's inability to keep up on an industrial basis with Russia in the long term. And this is why, in their opinion, it is best to get out of Ukraine sooner rather than later. And you have, more reports of the Americans saying, well, we're going to fund Ukraine until the end of this year. Well, we don't know about next year. Several articles all across the board, publications like Political, um, various retired generals saying the next 6 months are going to decide which way this war goes forever. Um, Other articles saying, I don't know where Ben Hodges got the idea that Ukraine is going to take Crimea, but they are not going to take, or there's almost no chance that they're going to take Crimea. So whether intentional or not, this is going to shift the narrative. And Bakhmut in itself has been the linchpin all along in the trench warfare that is Donbass from the north to the south. Like I say, it constitutes one line. And now the line will, if it falls or when it falls, it will have to go further west. The next line, of course, is Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka. Konstantinovka is actually, it goes on an angle, and it's actually not that far away from Gorlovka and Bakhmut. So it's basically next door to Chasov Yar, which is a small town, about a fraction of the size of Bakhmut, but bigger than some of these other villages. In any case, that's how I'm reading this right now. Um, like I say, these are bigger. You can argue that they're small gains, but they're bigger gains than what has been happening in the last 2 months for the Russians. And uh, even I'm surprised that in the Kupiansk-Liman axis, that the Russians have actually started to gain more territory as of today and yesterday. I'm sure we're going to get more news about these developments tomorrow. Um, and we shall see. We shall see. You know, one little item I read on Telegram was saying basically that the lower quality units will be left in Bakhmut, and they will not be expected to surrender. Um, Apparently, this is how things went in Solidar as well before it fell. Um, so, I don't know. The chances are it will happen that way, but Bakhmut has never been more surrounded till now. And like I say, there are more gains that have been made just as of today.
And continue on from that, we do have some news from Europe which does cascade from that. Now, you mentioned that EU meeting regarding Ukraine where you had van der Leyen going to Kiev. Well, we do have some news from Joseph Borrell, who said that the supply of fighter jets is not on the agenda, and he said that there are disagreements among EU member states, but the EU as a whole is not committing fighter jets. However, Poland has said that it will supply F-16s to Ukraine. I guess you could say the Chihuahua countries once again, even though I think that's a moniker more befitting of the Baltic states. But
Yeah.
I mean, because Poland, I think, I'm not saying it's a great power or anything, but it certainly would punch above what the Baltic states were if they were to get involved. In fact, a Polish intervention directly, I think, is one of the only things that could actually turn this war somewhat into Ukraine's favor, barring an outright coordinated full-on intervention from all the NATO powers, which would be once again a world war. So they have denied the reports that they're going to send the F-16s. So it's, I would assume it's A/B testing. They throw it out there. They throw out the rumors. We're going to send the F-16s. We're going to send fighters. They gauge the public's reaction. Then they deny the reports and gauge the public's reactions on that. And once again, they would be beholden to the European Union and NATO on this, despite being one of the more adamant members since the beginning of this war when it comes to funneling more into this war. After a certain point, somebody is going to pull on the leash, especially if it goes against the agreed upon direction in Ukraine, because if they do decide to begin divesting from Ukraine and pulling back from the war effort, or maybe even giving up on the war effort, they can't have the liability of a few states here and there that are still in it. It's much the inverse of, say, Hungary, where Hungary has been the dissenting party since the beginning of the war, has been dissenting on the sending of aid to Ukraine. But if they were to pull back, not that they would embrace Hungary, don't get me wrong, but Poland and states like Poland would find themselves as the outliers when it comes to that, because they would be the ones going against Ukraine and trying to stoke up the conflict where it's not. And continue on with some of our other European news, we have confirmation that Hungary, Austria, Italy, and Greece will not be sending weapons to Ukraine, and this was over the debate of the Leopard tanks in particular. And you have these countries one by one coming out saying that they weren't going to supply tanks. We do have a statement from the Italian foreign minister in particular saying, once again, those weasel words, but I'll read you his exact statement here. We have always sent defensive weapons to Ukraine, not offensive ones. We have not sent tanks and will not send them, according to the Italian foreign minister. So, even among countries with more hawkish governments, because you'll recall with the run up to the Italian election and the immediate aftermath of the Italian election, the leader of the winning coalition, who is now Prime Minister Meloni, who I'm sure is the disappointment of many here. I know a lot of people, and maybe even myself to a degree, had a little bit of higher hopes with the direction of the Italian government for some unknown reason. That foolish optimism, if there ever was foolish optimism, but it came out very adamantly pro-Ukraine. Same with the foreign minister, very adamantly pro-Ukraine. But even now, the belt is starting to tighten. The situation is starting to look less and less tenable, even if this is what these people truly do believe ideologically, or for whatever reason, they will cave to pragmatism and to the wills of course, the higher ups. And when you have Borrell and van der Leyen calling for I wouldn't exactly call it de-escalation because it's far from, but wanting not to throw tanks and not wanting to have these countries invest more than they already have into it. Once again, much like the Poland situation, generally they're not going to, because most of these European Union countries, NATO countries, even if they want to, just the way everything is interconnected with the infrastructure, realistically they can't. Now, we do have some more words from Milanovic, who is on the Mirovets list, may I remind you,
Yes.
saying on the 30th of January, quote, "What is the goal? The disintegration of Russia? The change of leadership? There is talk of tearing Russia apart. It is manic. The Serbs and I hate each other less. We had a much worse war than in Ukraine. I am against sending lethal means." So you have the dissent from Croatia once again. Now, if the parliament and the prime minister will actually follow suit, we have yet to see. My guess would be no. And because of this statement, the Ukrainian foreign ministry was outraged by this, and also comments he made that Crimea would never return to Ukrainian control. And he didn't even say that as necessarily a pro-Russia statement. Now, just the political climate, it is tacitly a pro-Russia statement, but he was saying it objectively that Ukraine is not going to retake Crimea anytime in the foreseeable future or in any plausible reality in the near future. So they have demanded a apology for his statements, and they're having the spokesman of the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry, Nikolenko, saying that he actually called the question of Ukrainian territorial integrity into question. So this great outrage over it, they once again referring to his words as unacceptable, and it continues down that path of several countries dissenting on the question of Ukraine refusing to send weapons or saying that they don't even have the capability to send weapons even if they would want to. So, picking up with some of the news we were covering on Hungary earlier, is that we have a quote from Zviarto, who also got himself in
Yeah.
a bit of a dispute with the American ambassador, but in reference to Ukraine in particular, he said Kiev has never been a partner of Budapest in the issue of the Transcarpathian Hungaries. In 2015, their rights have been consistently reduced and violated, so once again expressing outrage on the issue of the Hungarian diaspora. And previously, Orban and Sviarto have said that it would be a roadblock between any further Hungarian-Ukrainian cooperation, including membership in the EU, until the issue of Hungarians in Ukraine were addressed. Now, if, say, there were some caveat in the language laws and then the ethnic minority laws that would exempt Hungarians, for example, I personally don't think that would be grounds for Orban to suddenly become pro-Ukraine and support them in this war effort or the Hungarian government as a whole, but it is, once again, he's giving them a demand that he knows that they won't follow through, so of course he doesn't have to follow through on his end of it. Now, I'm not saying that it's completely cynical. I do believe that, at least to some degree, Orban and the Hungarian government do care about their ethnic diaspora, but it is ultimately a political move at the end of the day. But he has also gotten himself in a dispute with the American ambassador, who, to nobody's shock, is a homosexual man, and this was in regards
Yes.
to the aid to Ukraine.
Pressman. Is it
Yeah,
Daniel Pressman?
Pressman.
Yeah,
Yeah,
he said that him and his husband feel threatened in Hungary. It's so ridiculous. Oh my god.
This is
okay.
this is a joke we would have made 4 years ago. This is a joke we would have made 4 years ago, and this is an actual news story now. So you have Zviarto tell Pressman that Hungary is a sovereign nation and that it isn't going to bend to the will of either the United States or the European Union, which I do have to admit, although we have gotten statements approximating this before, this is a new level of division between the U.S. in particular and Hungary, because under the Trump era, there was a bit of a understanding, because Trump was the supposedly right-wing government, supposedly the nationalist government in the U.S., so Orban had some support. I'm not going to say a great amount of support, because even in the 2018 elections, you still did have the State Department trying to interfere and trying to throw Orban out of office in 2018.
Of course.
But in terms of the heads of state, the heads of government, there was a bit more of an understanding. Not entirely, but a bit more of an understanding. However, since Biden came into office, and you'll recall actually before Biden came into office, he said that we need to confront totalitarianism even in our allies, and he was referring particularly to Poland and Hungary at that point. Now, I'm sure Poland, with its actions in this recent year, has almost completely absolved itself. Now, don't be mistaken, Poland will still receive a lot of the criticism and a lot of the pushback when it comes to anything positive that their government does, that any of the cultural or social conservatism will be thrown out the window. any of the anti-migration laws, any of the anti-LGBTQ CIA stuff. That gets thrown out the window. The U.S. isn't behind that, but feel free to throw more and more into the Ukrainian black hole because that is the kind of relationship the U.S. has with its clients, especially in the 21st century. And I would say, especially in the Biden administration, is taking this to a whole new level. Now, once again, that's not some great defense of Trump because I think he is in large part responsible for a lot of this.
Hmm.
But
If I could
no,
interject, I
please
just
go
think
ahead.
this is such an old grievance now, really. Like like it's scratching at the bottom of the barrel. It's literally there just for the American homo choir and shit lib choir,
Known as the
just to say,
State
oh my
Department.
God, those mean Hungarians, opened up Soros University this moment. Like it's you know what I mean? It's old. It's so old. That's really what they're going with? Anyhow.
I I guess they're just running out of ideas that they just need to start repeating things, and hopefully, if they hammer on it just a little bit more, just a few more times, that it
Yeah.
will eventually turn over, that it eventually will have an effect, that Hungary will suddenly overthrow Orban and legalize gay marriage. But even when it came to the treatment of the ethnic Hungarians, and particularly when it came to this interaction with the ambassador, you had even opposition parties, even the one right wing opposition party that ran in coalition with the center left to try to get rid of Orban. It was once again one of those strange situations where they created an alliance of the outside thinking, much like what happened in Israel, where they ran in a coalition with the center and the center left in order to depose
Oust
Netanyahu, and then
Netanyahu.
you had that entire Lapid nonsense where he was supposedly part of this far right party that was beholden to the center left. But
Mm.
you even had the further right party that did that in Hungary stood with the Fidesz government that they have been consistently critical of, and I mean, their criticism ranges from they're not far right enough and they're too philo-Semitic to the point where, and then the other half the time is they're not pro-Soros enough. It's really just contrarianism is all I can really
Yeah.
describe it as. But even they rallied behind the Fidesz government and Orban and Sfiarto when it came to Pressman's criticisms of Hungary. So there is still a baseline of national unity in Hungary that I don't think exists in many other nations in the West, especially the U.S., especially the Anglosphere nations. I don't think that is there. Now, you could argue for some of the other continental European nations that might be there, but I think that might be a stretch for quite a few of them. But you did have that. You did have a general unity. You had a similar situation with the Turkish ambassador, with the U.S. ambassador to Turkey and the Turkish government that I'll get into in a bit here. But just to round out some of the European news, there is the continuance of the gas cap. That is going to go forward, and it is speculated that the gas cap could lead to actually a gas shortage, a gasoline shortage in the United States if carried on. And I mean, that's according to some economists' projections, so take that for what you will. I mean, it's coming from Bloomberg, so it's take it with a grain of salt, but I hate to say it. Bloomberg, I'll say, is one of the less egregious outlets. And I don't say that as, once again, I don't say that as some stunning endorsement, but when it comes to track records, theirs tend to be slightly better than most of the mainstream, at least in my opinion. But with that being said, just a couple more items out of Europe. Returning to the investigation on the Nord Stream pipeline, I imagine plenty of you, even people in this audience, have probably even forgotten about this. That they admit the explosions in both Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 had been carried out by a Western state, whether that be the US, the UK, one of the Scandinavian states, but there was that admission that from the investigators. Now, what will actually come of that, I can tell you is nothing, and the fact that some sort of admission is allowed to be made shows that it's past, nobody really cares anymore. But just to put a bow on that story from several months ago, Nord Stream was demolished by either the US or a proxy acting on behalf of the US. The UK has depleted its artillery, and they had pledged 30 of the AS 90 artillery pieces to Ukraine. And given their support for Ukraine throughout the duration of this war, it has almost completely stripped the UK of its artillery. Denmark finds itself in a similar situation when it comes to its artillery reserves, but when it comes to the shipping of weapons and the weapon shortages, I can only view this in one of two ways, and actually haven't quite made up my mind. They're either ceasing the shipment of weapons because they expect this conflict to come out on the losing end for Ukraine sooner rather than later, or these nations themselves, whether that be the UK, the US, France, Germany, whoever, are stopping the shipments of arms because they plan on directly intervening themselves, and they're not going to strip their arsenals any further than they already are if there is a direct intervention plan. And I'm not really sure where I fall. I would fall more towards the former, but I just have enough of a nagging feeling where I cannot discount the latter, and especially if the situation gets desperate enough, I could see some sort of harebrained proposal to go forward with that. Although, given the state of the military industrial complex across the West, whether that be in the US or any of the other European nations, I don't think they could sustain that war effort because if they can't sustain the funding and supplying of a proxy war, then they sure as hell cannot sustain an actual direct war effort, which is the main thing that cautions me against that. But once again, that is something you always have to keep in the back of your head, something you always have to consider that maybe they are reducing aid in preparation for a more direct approach.
Yes, you always have to consider that, right? Because politically, they've dug themselves in and backed themselves into a corner that politically they cannot survive. They cannot say, we were wrong. We assessed Russia wrong. We assessed our own strengths the wrong way. And, we're done. Russia can have this. We'll work out on a deal with Ukraine. Maybe if we can take Western Ukraine and turn that into a de jure instead of a de facto NATO base, and so on and so on. Like it's too late, right? So, but there's always that possibility, right? It's not a nice possibility, but as we said on the show for months now, we've always thought that um, we've always thought that Putin is always preparing and thinking of a much wider conflict with NATO.
Hence the building up of troops in Belarus. Many people suspected that the 250,000 Russian forces in Belarus were to open another Ukraine front, but since they have not moved towards Ukraine at this time including, it can only be assumed that they are positioned for either a first strike or a response to any NATO actions that would come out of Poland or the Baltic states. I would say, particularly with the Belarus troops, they are likely there in order to open up a corridor to Kaliningrad if it ever is cut off, and if Russia ever decides to take that action if Kaliningrad truly is isolated, which I don't think at this point is at any significant risk now. There was that towards the beginning of the war, about 9-10 months ago, when that was really in the talks last spring, but in terms of it happening now, I don't see that, but I can safely guess the troop buildup in Belarus is to liberate the Kaliningrad corridor if need be.
Yeah, I mean, America, after sort of saying for months and then again reiterating this last week and the week before that they are not going to send longer range missiles with more precise bombs. They're not real missiles in conjunction with the HIMARS, because the HIMARS can shoot various types of ammunition and shells. They have decided to give them longer range. This, I'm assuming, is going to be at least 50 kilometers longer than before. Um,
The figures I was seeing were 150-kilometer range
that's what
missiles
I,
were being
yes.
sent.
Whereas before it was 100. Um, I mean, we'll see. We'll see how the Russians adapt to it.
And we'll see if those are used for actual strikes into the Russian mainland, because you recall we covered previously, there was a story that came out of the Pentagon where the Pentagon gave Ukraine the green light to strike targets within Russia. And then there was the drone attack on one of the Russian air bases within the past few months. So that could be the next stage of the war, as Ukraine is being continually pushed back, that they do get the longer range missiles and that they do strike targets in Russia in hopes of either slowing them down or forcing some sort of retreat, or at least I would say being able to punch back as situation at home gets more and more dire. But we'll see how that actually does play out when the missiles arrive. And when it comes to a lot of these aid pledges, you also have to keep in mind the time that it takes from them to be pledged for them to be actually processed and delivered takes months. And that when we were discussing the shipments of Leopard tanks last week, and
Mm-hmm.
I even did see some report. Now, I can't attest to the validity of it or how serious it actually was, but something that Germany approved a single Leopard tank to be sent to Ukraine. But when it comes to actually processing and getting the aid over to Ukraine, whether that be by a land route or a sea route, once again, this takes months. And that a lot of the pledged aid from the last 2 weeks is going to arrive probably in August, is when they were projecting it. And that also depends on the direction of the war. That depends on how proactive Russia would be in striking supply lines and how far
Mm-hmm.
west they're willing to strike supply lines, because that has been one of the biggest hangups for Russia this war, that they have been rather hesitant, and for understandable reasons, to strike supplies coming from NATO countries before they enter Ukraine, or too close to the Polish border, too close to the territorial waters of one of the NATO states in the Black Sea, or whatever. But we'll see how that continues and how the war does continue. Several times Russia has threatened to retaliate against nations that are supplying Ukraine. Now, how much of that is political hot air versus how much of that is genuine threat is really up to interpretation, even though I would say it leans more towards the political hot air. But point being is, if, I imagine especially if Ukraine does get and successfully use the long range missiles, and they do consistently, I'll reemphasize, consistently hit targets within Russia, you could see a more aggressive Russian response to the NATO supply lines going
Mm-hmm.
into Ukraine as that continues, especially as the aid continues to trickle in over these next few months based on previous pledges.
Yeah. America played a kind of an interesting trick with the Germans this past week. So Germany had asked for America to make a pledge to send tanks before it would, and apparently this was Blinken's idea. America said they would pledge 31 Abrams, and as it turned out, America later specified that they would not send them until the end of 2023. Like, I mean, if Putin is the next Hitler, surely even suboptimal machinery, like you would do far more,
You'd be sending him
right?
Shermans at that point.
Yes, yes. I mean, surely you would do far more than that, right? Which is like it's just hilarious to me. Um, I mean, I can understand how some people might be conspiratorial and say like the war is not really happening because of if America was really serious, they would have done more. They wouldn't have. um, had only one game plan, which was don't worry, the sanctions are going to crush the Russians just when they think they're winning. You know, just when you think the election has been won by Trump, at the stroke of 3 a.m., new ballots will come in.
Once again,
It
like a cape ship movie climax, they're in love with this kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's really true. they, they are in love with it. Oh Lord. So yeah, so I can understand that point of view, but I mean it is a real war, and if you look at all past wars, that we consider real, all kinds of things happened. I discussed on this show back in the last spring where you know, Swiss banks, they could have frozen the bank accounts of the Nazis in if they wanted to. They eventually did, but it was just months, just like I think they froze their accounts late February of 1945, but the war in Europe was over May 9th. So, I mean, 2 months and uh, 2 weeks, so. I mean, one could have a more sort of nuanced idea about what a war is. Um, I think the more existential it is, the further countries will go. But I think part of the reason they do what they do is they know that war is not permanent. War is temporary, and then something has to be agreed upon afterwards.
Yes, and the impression of the past 20 years of American interventions has given the exact opposite impression because of Iraq, Afghanistan, that these wars stretch out so long that they're viewed as perpetual, that when it comes to actually facing a conventional enemy and when it comes to actually being even just involved in a war with two conventional sides, I think even though they may rationally understand, there's a certain disconnect where they can't fully understand that wars have an end and wars usually end in some sort of negotiation, and that it isn't just a withdrawal or a total victory as the Americans have been accustomed to, because you can go back through the history of American wars and they once again they end in a withdrawal or they end in a total American victory, and that negotiating the end of a war on comparable terms is rather alien to the American mindset
Mhm.
throughout its history. And even that even gets applied to foreign conflicts, because how many times have you seen since the beginning of the Ukraine war that there can't be any negotiations till Russia gives up all its holdings in Ukraine that's taken since the beginning of the war, since it withdraws from Crimea and meets several other criteria before we can even begin the negotiations. Give up all your powering before you can even get to the bargaining table. That has been the American approach to negotiations, and simply when you're negotiating with a power that can actually hold its own, I'm not even saying necessarily a peer power, because I know some people dispute that Russia has underperformed militarily, blah blah blah. Not that I really hold those views, but just to again give the maximum credence to the argument coming out of the American State Department. Even a comparable country, once again, they're not going to surrender everything before they even sit down to negotiate.
Yes. The other thing too is people misunderstand the pace of a war. You hope that it ends quickly, but no war, very few wars ever end quickly, right? Especially when so much is at stake. And when you consider how much is at stake in this war, right? Um, Countries will, let's say, they will use a lot of missiles, and then they will decide not to. Maybe there'll be an opportune time later where they will use a great amount of missiles for a new offensive, and so on, right? Pace matters. Russia always has to think that, the 27, 28 countries plus America, so roughly 30 countries that are actively supporting Ukraine, will if it looks like Ukraine is going to lose, and based on their rhetoric, will come into Ukraine. They will have to do something now. Um, there is that bit of news that came out yesterday that America is sending 200 contractors to Ukraine who will be embedded with special artillery units uh, and other military material to fix problems at that point. This is not going to include, I would think, not tanks, but it's to cut down on time for smaller arms fire or smaller, maybe towed cannons as opposed to mechanized cannons. Um, in order to, because there was an article that popped up the other day, I think it was on Wednesday, basically saying that uh, lots of this equipment is breaking down. We don't know how to fix it. They are literally texting and messaging the American military in Europe on guides on how to fix some of the problems that they're having with the machinery that America sent them. I would also say that basically this is a mission creep. The Americans are these guys, I mean, I doubt many of them are really technicians, right? Because it stipulates that um, there could be many more that will come in that will not be US citizens, but will be non-American mechanics. So remember, they always say they're not going to do something, and then eventually they will. Or they say they're going to send something, but actually it's already in Poland, and it's going in that night.
Yes, and this
So
is traditionally how American interventions from Vietnam onward have worked. It's been they've dripped, they've dripped, they've dripped until you have a full American intervention. Now, in terms of a full official boots on the ground war, I doubt that's going to happen, but they're going to throw everything they can into Ukraine without resorting to that they can, whether that be contractors, whether that be advisors, whether that be technicians, whatever they want to call them, they're going to put as much as they can in there without number one breaking the bank and number two leading to a greater scale war.
mhm, mhm.
And just a couple last pieces of European news I have before we get to the China balloon, because I know you're probably all eager to talk about the balloon, is that the shenanigans over NATO expansion do continue. Sweden says it. Finland says it will not accept admission if Sweden is also not admitted. You have Turkey continuing to hamstring the process, and they the rationale that they've given this time is, to get the exact words here, that they wanted, and this is also in reference to the issues with the American ambassador, where you have the Turkish Interior Ministry told the U.S. ambassador to keep their dirty hands out of Turkish affairs. So you have that, and then you have Turkey affirming that no, they will not be continuing forward with the process because it doesn't meet the certain protocols of ratification. So once again, Turkey kicking this can down the road. I can't imagine we will see any actions on the NATO expansion issue until after the Turkish elections, whether that be in Erdogan's favor or not, because certainly if they get their guy in, NATO expansion is going to go forward, Turkey is going to be completely flipped, and things are going to look a lot better for NATO. But if Erdogan stays, or somebody else who serves the same role of being that level of stumbling block, you're not going to get NATO expansion anytime soon, and that I'll be sure to cover this as we go on because I believe that they are in May, that the final round of the Turkish elections, even though they'll probably end the first round if things go like I'm anticipating, probably going to be a majority Erdogan victory in the first round, is just my projection off the bat. But they're going to sink everything they have into the Turkish elections and possibly even try to force a Maidan style situation in Turkey if Erdogan is reelected, because it is the most vital piece of the puzzle right now in NATO, especially when it
Mhm.
comes to the confrontation with Russia, especially when it comes to Turkey's very divided, I wouldn't even necessarily say loyalties, but their more pragmatic approach to both NATO and Russia, that it is going to be of the utmost importance to get somebody who is completely in line with the NATO mission in office in Turkey. So that is going to be probably one of the most important elections in years. I would actually argue probably even more significant than the U.S. 2024 election will be the Turkish 2023 election.
Yeah, Turkey is showing no signs of reversing direction. Um, America continues to make the threat that they're not going to be given the F-16s. I don't think Turkey cares. And they're adamant that they are not going to allow Sweden into NATO. Um, don't know how much of a big difference that's going to make, but it's symbolically very important. Um, I think what this signals is Turkey does not feel it ever has to do anything um, that NATO is asking it to do. Unlike, let's say, Serbia, which there are no partners close enough to give it aid. And especially at this time of war, there are no countries in between that would even allow Russian access into that area. Turkey is not in such a position, and of course, they're taking full advantage of all of this. And yeah, we will see where it goes. They're a very strong indicator of how strong or weak America is in this regard, not just how strong of a hand they have.
And the last piece of news I have before we get on to the China balloon story is some of the talks that are happening between Serbia, Kosovo, and the European Union. So, the US and the European Union have been, in the last few months in particular, strong arming Serbia on the issue of Kosovo, promising them some sort of resolution, some sort of compromise if they continue with European integration, if they continue to isolate themselves from Russia. So they've been put in a position where, in order to continue European integration, which I don't know why they would want to do at this point, especially, they will need to come to some sort of compromise on the Kosovo issue. And the U.S. has very, I would say disingenuously, said to Vucic and the Serbians that if you cooperate with us on the Russia issue, if you stop violating sanctions, we will facilitate talks in Kosovo that will end in your favor, that will cede parts that are still majority ethnically Serbian to you and ensure their protections and so on and so forth, which I have no reason to believe that any of that would actually be carried out.
Yes,
Nor do I
exactly.
believe that anyone in Serbia would. And even Vucic, who has been probably one of the biggest back and forth figures in just the political sphere in that part of the world in recent years. He has, because when he first came on my radar 2018, 2019, I thought that, well, of course he's leading the country right into the European Union. 2019, 2020 come around, and I start to see somebody who's a bit more dissenting. Then, of course, this war happens. I see somebody who is not going to toe the line, but then you have the issue in Kosovo inflamed again, and it seems that armed conflict might actually be on the horizon. Now, that has not come to fruition. That's been over this past year and a half. But now you have these very, once again, disingenuous offers from the U.S. State Department that we can resolve the Kosovo issue. We can broker some sort of agreement that will allow you to continue with European integration. If you, I think they said something like are in line with the rest of the European countries, referring, of course, to the question of Russia and the sanctions. But there has been, it's been unclear, at least to me, and perhaps you have more insight on this, about what direction Serbia will actually take, whether they actually are on the brink of capitulation, whether they will actually go along with this and will finally kiss the ring, or whether they are just leading the U.S. along because of the current situation, trying not to provoke them too much, but ultimately are going to reject their offer. I wouldn't say that I foresee Vucic or the current Serbian government throwing away everything to pursue some vain hope of European integration, especially at this time, especially with the current state of the European Union, and especially with the growing blocks of dissent, and even going down to the agreements that have been made between Austria, Hungary, Croatia, and Serbia when it comes to forming these blocks independent of both the European Union and NATO and other organizations. So I don't foresee that, but the screws are being tightened on the Kosovo issue,
Yeah.
and once again, I cannot see a clear resolution to this anytime in the near future. And I
Well,
still,
I mean, I was talking about
yeah,
this
go ahead.
with my dad, and I mean, basically, if Vucic goes along with it, I mean, he's finished. He cannot live in Serbia anymore. It's over. If he concedes, if he buckles under the pressure and gives Kosovo, or has to recognize Kosovo, right? Remember, there was a trade agreement that was made, and it allowed Serbs to move back. It was a very favorable trade agreement for Serbia because it didn't require anything for Serbia to give to Albania, because the interlocutor for the trade was basically just Kosovo. I forget all the details because honestly, it was about 2 years
Yeah,
ago.
that was the sweetheart deal that Trump and Grenell came to Serbia with.
Right, right, and he like that was good, but in a sense, that what this war did is it forced the tightening of the screws and going back before that agreement, right? Maybe because the agreement was too favorable. Maybe, on the other hand, very few Serbs are ever going to move back to Kosovo for obvious reasons, because they're a minority and they're targets of Albanian violence. But if he concedes, if he buckles, it's over. He cannot live, and he will have to move to Switzerland. He will become a persona non grata. It'll be most likely Switzerland. Uh,
He could
I don't know.
split rent with
Maybe
Zelensky.
maybe Spain or some other country where they don't care. But he, you know what I mean? It's over. He can't even be in the Balkans.
Oh no.
There's nowhere he can go. And he's not like, he's a fairly more important political leader, mostly because Serbia is more politically important than many of the other countries in the Balkans. Some of it has to deal with the fact that the West is so antagonistic to him, but there's more notoriety around him than any other leader in the Balkans. Let's be honest. And uh, Serbia has resisted the gay more than any other country. Many of these countries adopted the gay decades and decades ago. So there's nowhere for him to go. And if he has any money, he will move to Switzerland or some other or to an obscure country. But if he wants to remain in Europe, he'll move to Switzerland.
Oh,
He'll go
certainly. And
down in infamy. His whole family will live in infamy.
like I said, I don't foresee this happening, but the screws are tightening, and
Yeah.
like you said, it's either going to end. He is going to stand firm and stand against this, or he is going to live his life in exile and shame. In which case, he's a strange figure. Again, I can't really peg him down anywhere when it comes to that sort of view. But I don't foresee, with what I know about him. Now, of course, I don't know the guy personally, but from observing him from the past 4.5 years, the way he's conducted himself politically, I don't foresee him buckling on this, despite him, I guess you could say, stringing along the U.S. and the European Union when it comes to this
Right,
issue.
because
But
he said he would rebuild Ukraine. He has to say those things. What else is he going to say? Who's going to rescue him? I mean, it's not 1999, right? Um, Russia is in a much greater war, and Europe is much more united against Russia than in 1999, because it's not, the Chechens. So, like I say, it's either going to be one of those two things. So far, he hasn't buckled. I hope he doesn't. Um, we'll wait and see. The European Union, um, Today, for instance, the Ukrainians shelled Donetsk city again with 16 rounds. And why? Why? Because they're not winning anywhere else. And when the gay is not winning um, against Russia, they'll punish Serbia. They'll put the pressure on Serbia to get at least a humiliation victory, right? Um, Strategically, while Serbia is the last friendly nation in the Balkans towards Russia, and in any significant way, um, it is not that strategic, right? There are so many machinations that have developed and been fulfilled last year that uh, for instance, the the sanctions on gas and oil, for instance, just to name a few, where Russia now needs interlocutors like Turkey to ship its oil and gas, right? Like Russia will still do business with Serbia. They have their 10-year contract that's coming up this May. I'm very sure that Serbia will sign on to it. Um, I would say, in a way, Orban's government is really been the inspiration in the Balkans. No other country besides it and Serbia. Um, in some way, maybe Orban is. We've spoken about Orban actively donating and supporting Republika Srpska in Bosnia. So Orban has a stake in this too, to some degree. I'm sure he would not like to see Vucic fall. Um, Vucic is still very much a young man. Um, I would guess the next thing will be the gay will try to do another color revolution in Serbia, or at least divide them enough over the next election.
Well,
You
I think
know,
it's interesting you said that because I was just about to say, much like with the Putin question, it's not necessarily that they think they'll get somebody amenable to them in Serbia.
yeah,
Now, I think they're much more likely to get somebody more amenable in Serbia than they are Russia. But if they can topple Vucic, if they can force him to flee the country and create a degree of political instability, they can push Serbia back even further. Even if you do get somebody who's more hardline on the Kosovo question
yeah.
in power, in which case you probably would. But at that point, he's more hardline, but he has far less to work with. So I think it's in the interest of Orban, it's in the interest of this forming bloc between Hungary, Austria, Croatia, Serbia, and you could even include Slovakia in that. But this new, I guess you could say, alternative or successor organization to V4 because V4 fell apart with Hungary and to much lesser extent Slovakia's dissent on the issue on Ukraine, whereas Poland and the Czech Republic were very adamant on the Ukraine question. But this Central Eastern Balkan bloc you're getting forming, it's going to be of the utmost interest for everyone involved in that, whether that be Orban, whether that be Milanovic in Croatia, whether it be any of the involved parties, to keep Vucic both in power and in the same camp he's in when it comes to being pro-Russia and also keeping the West at arm's length and not being completely anti-Western, because I do think completely anti-Western would not serve Serbia's interests right now because it would just lead to.
No, you can imagine yeah. I think those are all great points. I think also the on some level, especially the hardliners in the West, are furious because Serbia has a ton of Soviet era munitions and weapons.
It is a gold mine compared to what they could have, and of course, especially when you look at, say, like what Bulgaria was, and you have Serbia
Hmm.
as the largest fragment left of Yugoslavia, so to speak, and the largest and I think even economic-wise most productive nation in the Balkans. But I, I suppose that depends on whether you consider Romania Balkans. But again, that's getting
It's
into minutia.
Balkans.
Yeah, yeah. But point being is like the heart of the Balkans, like what you would
Right,
think,
right.
like the former Yugoslavia is more so what I'm
Yeah.
referring to. But out of all the pieces that made up that, Serbia, of course, is the largest leftover one, sitting on, at least compared to its neighbors and compared to a lot of other European countries, mountains of Soviet era weapons that, of course, the Ukrainians would love to have, but they're not getting access to. And once again, I don't think even in the position where, say, worst case scenario, Vucic gets pushed out, somebody else replaces him. Even then, although it may put Serbia in a weaker position, I don't see the arms caches opening up to Ukraine.
Hmm. Hmm. I'm sure that's what they wanted. They wanted that
Oh,
kind of
absolutely.
capitulation, and so he didn't. And then, of course, the cost has to be Kosovo.
And with European news out of the way, I think it's time we get to the much anticipated China balloon. So,
Mm.
it was on Thursday night that a balloon was spotted over Montana. Now, it was this big white balloon with a little satellite tied to it. Now, according to the experts, it was allegedly flying at 66,000 feet, which, just to put in perspective, the max altitude they let civilian airliners fly at, like something that you would take a commercial flight on, is 42,000 feet. And that's, of course, 42,000 American. I don't have the metric calculations off the top of my head. I think it was like something. I can't remember the what it was, but I did see the metric figure somewhere for the balloon, but that's aside the point. And it was initially spotted over Montana, caused a great deal of panic. Now, mind you, this is not the first device of this, even Chinese device of this kind, to fly over the U.S. And the ultimate conclusion, I'll tell you the end and then fill in the details afterwards, is it flew its course over the U.S., and then as we were starting to record this show, about 15 minutes before we started recording, the China balloon was shot down by an F 22 over the Atlantic Ocean. Now, it does make you question, at that point, what good was downing the balloon? Because, assuming it was for some sort of spy purposes, it had to fulfill its mission. You let it fly straight across past the U.S. Now, the initial reason they gave, which I find somewhat believable, is that they didn't want to risk the debris falling on civilian areas or causing damage to property or people. And I can kind of believe that. But at the point where you're going to let the balloon fly all the way across the U.S. and then shoot it down, that just makes it look even more conspicuous. Now, my ultimate take on this, and this also includes the one that was allegedly spotted over western Venezuela, which make of that what you will, is that, look, it may have been a spy device, but we also do need to consider that China is one of the top military powers in the world and one of the top technological and economic powers in the world as well, to the point where they have actual satellites in space, similar to the U.S. has, what the Russians have, and hell, even the Iranians have a satellite, if you want to just put that in perspective.
Hmm. Hmm.
It's not that hard. And again, I'm not saying like Iran's like some backward, but Iran is a tertiary power. It doesn't have much in the way of like say a China or a Russia does. So just to put that in perspective, it's not that hard to get a satellite up when Iran can do it, when Israel can do it, when several nations can send up a satellite. It doesn't. I don't know. Maybe they used to, but I suppose it's kind of hard to take down a satellite. But I think South Africa sent them up at some point when they were still a functional nation. So once again, it's not that hard. So when it comes to, I mean, North Korea also satellites. Just to hammer home the point, you don't need a balloon device in order to get spy satellites up in the air when you have the capability to actually shoot them up in space. And what this balloon was, the Chinese claimed it was for weather research, which, hell, for all we know, it might have been. It might have gone off course. And like I said, the Chinese have so much more sophisticated methods of gathering intelligence. I think about how many Chinese intelligence ring busts there have been in the U.S. over just the past 5 years. I mean, they have networks in just about every major university, every major tech company. Again, they have a very sophisticated intelligence network. And I'm not saying that's like some sort of one-sided agreement. I mean, of course, the U.S. has networks in China, Russia has networks in the U.S., and then they all have networks in Europe. Again, this is just how intelligence agencies work. I'm not like pointing fingers or passing moral judgments for the time being, that is. And with that, you had this. And I think this is the third one since 2019 that was spotted over U.S. airspace. The third balloon that was spotted over U.S. airspace that was a Chinese satellite. Now, it's funny because some of the libs were saying that, oh, it's the radical MAGA Republicans who wanted to fearmonger about this because they're actually trying to take away your Social Security. Like the same sort of like just normal like establishment Democrat narratives that you would get. But in my opinion, what it was, look, it may very well been a spy device. I don't think it was because, like I
Mm.
said, there's so much more sophisticated methods. Even I mean, it did fly over Montana. Montana is one of the sites for the missile silos. Once again, they have real satellites that are about on par with the U.S. They have intelligence network within the U.S. They have actual like aircraft they could fly over, similar to how the
Yeah.
U.S. has spy aircraft. Pretty much every major country has spy aircraft that can fly over long distances. So it's not anything that they would have needed a balloon for. Just to send that
I
point home.
know it's so ridiculous,
It's
but it can steer itself. Yeah, barely. It's not like it's not an F-15 or an F-16. Duh. Like
no this.
I know. Like I mean, some people have hypothesized that the Chinese did this in order to troll the Americans and laugh at them. While that is an entertaining idea in and of itself, and I would even wish it were true, I personally don't buy it. Uh,
I don't either, and I was actually just about to bring that up. But in terms of and what people said that in the particular context that this was payback for Pelosi's little stunt in Taiwan. Now,
mm,
I don't buy it because I think the Chinese could have done something much more substantive in that regard, but once again, I do think that this was some sort of maybe it was a military device, but I don't think it was supposed to be over the US because I just don't think that once again, if even if this was some sort of intimidation or trolling tactic, they have much more effective ways of communicating that than just something that is just a speck in the sky when it comes to the naked eye. But it was more so the response of the U.S., which we somewhat touched on already, that really sent this home. The response to the Pentagon saying we have no plans to shoot it down at this time. Pentagon also said something of, we're not going to reveal the location because it's visible if you can see it in the sky, and so there's no reason to. But when it comes to this, it did make the U.S. look foolish in its response. So even if that wasn't the initial intent, it certainly succeeded in that. And honestly, the best take on the balloon actually comes from Bill Crystal because I need to
I'm so
tell you
glad you think
what
this.
Bill Crystal had
Yeah.
said. So, famed neoconservative, great advocate for the state of Israel and for
Mm.
war with Russia is if the balloon had anti-black history messages stenciled on it, or if it were dropping anti-trans pamphlets down to earth, or if it were broadcasting denunciations of wokeness, MAGA would be pro-balloon. They would be welcoming the balloon. They would be worshipping the balloon. Those are Bill Kristol's words
Insane.
regarding the balloon. That is his main response. And also, when it comes to Twitter responses, I did touch on this a bit earlier, from Dash Dobovsky, who you might know as the "oh boy" guy. Anytime Trump farts in the wrong direction, he makes a video like with his like very uncanny faces, like "oh boy, did he hear what Trump did?" Like I'm sure you all know the guy I'm talking about right now. And he says the Chinese balloon hysteria is distraction from the fact that Republicans want to eliminate Social Security and Medicaid benefits.
Oh my God.
So this is the general reaction to the balloon. It caused, I would say, what can be classified as low levels of panic combined with just the American political circus, for example. You had people turn this into a partisan debate, much like you had with Bill Kristol and that Dash oh boy guy who was my absolute favorite if you're unaware. But it's the American media cycle, the American culture war cycle reacted exactly how you'd expect it to. Nobody will be talking about this in 48 hours, and that's even a generous assessment. Maybe I should even say 24, or even 12 hours at this point. By the time You know what? This will probably actually air almost immediately after recording, given the time of day, so I shouldn't say that. But by the time the new week begins, Monday morning, you're getting ready for work, you're going on about your day, looking forward to the new week. Nobody will be talking about this. But what I do think the actual reason this did gain such prominence in the media cycle is that they needed an out from Ukraine. They needed something to withdraw attention, and this will probably be the first of these many sort of campaigns, but they need something to make people think about China. Now, you recall the brief report we read from the Department of Defense on anticipating a U.S. China confrontation by 2025. I do think that they are priming the pump for that. Now, am I saying they have direct war plans? No. But I do think they're anticipating, if not a direct confrontation with China, far more hostilities and heightened tension with China. So they're trying to direct the American public consciousness in that direction. So they'll talk about the China balloon. So they'll talk about anything to do with China and start to forget about the Ukraine issue. We've seen them shift narratives several times in the past, and a lot of people mistake them for direct narrative shifts. For example, everyone was concerned about the COVID virus one day, and then they woke up the next day it was the Ukraine thing. But you have to remember, once again, they were priming the pump for Ukraine since April of 2021 at that point, with the initial Russian troop buildup, at least that time. So they drip feed you these things. They
Mhm.
slowly build up to these things. I would say Convid is actually one of the few exceptions where they just sort of sprung it on you. And even that did take a little bit for them to like drip feed it to you. But I do think, and I don't think this is the first one, and it certainly won't be the last, they're drip feeding the general public information and hysteria about China and looking forward to a Chinese conflict, which is why I think in particular, even though it had completed its alleged mission, if it was on a spy balloon mission, which is why they downdrove the Atlantic Ocean to give that impression that this was a hostile entity in American airspace, which apparently not hostile enough to down right away, which I'm reliably told the balloon was white, but had it been black, they would have downed it at first sight. Is what I am reliably told. Um, but I don't know. The satellite was black. Does that make it? Does that make it like mixed race? I don't know. I don't know. But downing it is a nice display of force. It shows that the American Air Force is still capable of conducting combat operations, especially at high altitude when it comes to that sort of nature of warfare, in which case, if there were a more direct confrontation between the U.S. and China, even just in the Pacific, you could expect balloons to actually be used. I mean, balloons still do have usefulness, even when it would come to the when it would come to a conventional air war. So, again, perhaps that will be the speculation. They were weapons testing, whatever. But point being is, it seamlessly accomplished what they wanted to. The American media cycle has not shut up about China since. And strange enough, the most dissenting view I've actually heard on this, on terms of mainstream media, was Republican AM talk radio pretty much saying that, like, well, if China wanted to spy on us, they got satellites and spy networks, so why do they need a balloon? Which, again, coming from AM Republican talk radio, think about that. Think about that. But once again, I think it did its goal. I think whether this was intentionally over the U.S. or not, I think at that point this is irrelevant. But it managed to shift American public focus to the question of China and what U.S.-Chinese relations and what a U.S.-Chinese confrontation will look like in the coming years.
Yeah, you know, it probably is a bit of a primer, maybe to get the shit libs on side with the let's say with the conservatives. But if Bill Kristol's assessment is correct, and I think to a large extent it is, um, I would say it's, maybe marginally effective. I think you're right. Um, the main work, its main task, is to draw attention away from Ukraine. The fact that the balloon thing even happened is just because America does not want to go to China. Blinken was supposed to meet with Xi Jinping, when it really should have been president to president. But in any case, I would say that this indicates China was, in some regards, willing to accommodate Blinken, even though he is not peer. Notice that, what's his name? Yi Zhang or Yi Wang. Yi Wang is normally that's his counterpart. That's who normally Blinken is met with. But my guess is the balloon thing that it started. I mean, it's happened dozens of times, and you never hear about it because weather balloons are a common thing. Uh, they don't want America to go to China and come back empty-handed. Schultz went to Venezuela and tried to convince them. He went to, sorry, not Venezuela, but Brazil and Argentina. They refused to give arms.
Oh yeah, and he was in Venezuela
Remember
talking about the
Biden's
oil issue
visits
too.
to
Yeah.
Saudi Arabia in order to get them to comply with sanctions on Russian oil? They said get lost. They literally said no. We're not cutting down production and or I think what was it? Not cutting down production. He wanted them to increase production.
Yeah, that's what
In
it
any
was.
case, what he got was basically a deal with with the Chinese and the Saudis um, it, you know, to make transactions for resources in the yuan, right? Um, it's ridiculous. It's like the United Arab Emirates right now is buying Russian oil that's coming over from India, and that's not being done with the U.S. dollar. That's being done with the United Arab Emirates uh,
Instead,
dollar.
oil will likely be sold to Europe, as you may have
Yes,
guessed. So
yeah, they'll pay more. They'll just pay more,
they'll pay
and
more in an exchange that, frankly, strengthens Russia, sending it through one or two, or even in some cases three different middlemen. You recall Saudi Arabia was even buying Russian oil in order to flip it and sell it. That several countries have gotten in on this grift because it's it's an amazing economic model if you're one of these middle nations. I mean, you even have also Turkey, which has also turned itself into an energy hub, despite its, let's just say, uneasy relationship with Europe. They're still in that
Mhm.
position where several of these secondary and tertiary powers have been given a world of opportunity by these sanctions, honestly. And
Yeah.
although we do have the reports that Russian economic growth did outpace that of even Germany because of the
Yes,
sanctions, that
they're expected to exceed Germany's economy in 2023.
that
And
is
yeah, they expect the Russian economy to make even more gains in 2024. The whole thing has completely backfired, right?
that's
But
absurd. But I mean I believe it. But that's like just the conceptually absurd. But
yeah,
when it comes to the real winners of this, I would say it is these secondary and tertiary nations that have found a new life in this. When it comes to, I mean, some people may think it's strange to call India, especially with its population size and position, a secondary nation. But I would say, considering its level of development, it would still fall under secondary nation. But the India superpower people might actually be vindicated, but they might have just been a decade early. I'll just put it that way.
mhm.
But again, they've become a great middleman for energy trade, and as relations continue to improve with both Russia and China, they're going to enjoy that position. You already have several nations that are petitioning to join BRICS even now, and you've had Algeria, Argentina, and Iran have applied for membership, and it's suspected that Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Egypt, and Afghanistan are also considering membership. Now, a lot of people may look at those and think those are third world nations, at least most of them. They're shithole countries, which, I mean, in many ways, yes, I can understand that, but also you're ignoring the strategic significance of these countries
Yes.
despite your personal feelings. Once again, like, I'm not some, like, great, like, I don't have, like, this great love affair with the third world. Not that I think anyone here does, but just to put it on record, it's not like I have some great infatuation with the third world, but I'm not going to ignore the strategic significance of the countries I listed because their populations, admittedly, are not as smart or as advanced as the West. I mean, that doesn't mean they're not capable, especially their leadership class, aren't capable of making sound decisions based
That
on the
benefit them.
geopolitical environment. Exactly.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a bias that a lot of people do have to put aside. But point being is, when you have a growing coalition of secondary and tertiary nations, again, a lot of these countries now, maybe barring, say, something like Iran or Afghanistan, okay, Afghanistan maybe up until the Taliban take over, countries that the U.S. also had been actively trying to court for the past 20, 30 years since the end of the Cold War, even back into the course of the Cold War. These nations that the U.S. has sunk billions into trying to influence the direction of and trying to bring into their world order are actively eschewing them and joining in on this growing alternative system. Now, the long term success of this is yet to be spoken to, but once again, going over those nations, while they may not strike you as world superpowers, I mean, you have Argentina, a massive Latin American nation, probably one of the most stable Latin American nations of that. Algeria, one of the largest African nations and major energy producers. Iran, great strategic position, energy producer. You have Indonesia, massive nation right in the middle of the Pacific, wonderful strategic location. Energy giant Saudi Arabia, very strategically positioned Turkey and Egypt, and very strategically positioned Afghanistan. Like I said, I'm under no illusion that any of these are first world nations just to make that qualification for the final time.
Yeah.
But these are very strategic nations that are good to have in your camp. And they are increasingly, maybe not entirely, but increasingly leaning towards Russia and China.
Right. China is providing an alternative, right? That's what this is about. China has an alternative to them. They've always wanted an alternative to America, and China is providing that.
It reminds
And
me of
China
that.
is not a third world country. Like you can talk about poor spots in China. I don't care. There are parts of America that are equally as bad. Um, uh, China's a different country. It has a very long history. It's going to be around much, much longer,
Yeah, and
and it's not going to go down. um, despite what some people will hope for. So, yeah, just take a look at how ludicrous. Like, I was watching CSIS and on YouTube, and they had the former French ambassador to America and the UN. I believe his last name is Gerard, and he was being interviewed by Ben Judah on Ukraine, right, ascension into the EU. And to his credit, he gave very technical reasons why that can't happen, or it can't happen right now. And primarily, but his caveat was um, basically it can happen, but the rules could be redrawn, and and there's the rub. But they still have to have this pretense with few EU leaders going to Kiev and having these ridiculous meetings, as if Kiev is any position in 1 year to be part of NATO. As if who's going to foot the bill? Oh yeah, of course, balkanized Russia will foot the bill. It's just ludicrous. It's stupid.
yeah, and touching once again on the China point, again, you can talk about these backwater Cantonese villages, but that does not change the capability that China has to perform on the world stage. In which case, it's proven itself increasingly capable. And
Yeah.
it reminds me once again of that famous exchange where the I believe he's a Kenyan man talking about how China has a much more positive reception in Africa because when the Chinese diplomats come, you leave with investments in hospitals and infrastructure. When the British and the Western diplomats come, you leave with the lectures. And then just fulfilling the joke. You have a Westerner saying, "But have you considered the real cost of that, and how are you going to pay for that debt?" And it's like, well, right there's the lecture. And
Yeah. And this is literally because gay rights.
oh,
That's
absolutely.
that's that's the only reason. They want them fully culturally integrated. It can't just be business. No, you mustn't have that much autonomy. I mean, trans kids and gay rights are literally the shibboleths that help the gay identify who's on board and who's not.
I mean, the only Western country that I have seen that has even come close to implementing the pragmatic model that you've seen of Russia and China on the world stage, and they're doing this less and less over years. France. France's relationship with its former colonies was that very pragmatic relationship where they were still benefiting greatly from the billions that they would pour into it. Now, once again, you can do the cost benefit, see if it was really worth it. But point being is, when a country like China sends billions abroad, they come back with resources. They come back with joint ownership, and sometimes maybe they even have to repossess because of the debt situation. Perhaps they even structure it that way, which once again, I really don't care that much. But point being is, they come back with resources and having gained power and a strategic position over this. When now, I'm not saying it's due surely to incompetence because I think a large part of it is deliberate strategy. But when the U.S. dumps billions of dollars into Afghanistan or Iraq, they stay as fragmented, divided nations that become black holes of money. Like I said, I know the reason for that, but when you look at the longevity of a nation and how it's actually going to perform on the world stage with influence, and actually being a respectable power that has the ability to represent the interests of its people, while in some cases the investment may not pay off, when you look theoretically and even somewhat in practice to the model that Russia and China implement with the money that they send abroad, they are actually reaping something from it. Once again, you can talk about how China invests in these lithium mines in Africa. Well, guess what? They're getting the lithium. That's more than you can say about the U.S. at this point.
Good point.
But that's all I had on the China balloon and the entire China situation. And speaking of the secondary and tertiary powers, you do have continued progress with Turkey in Syria as they are continuing to withdraw their forces. So they're dismantling observation points along the M4 highway, according to a Syrian reporter in South Idlib. And once again, referring to the sanctions question, we did say that the U.S. was sending delegates to Turkey and the United Arab Emirates in order to warn them about the consequences of not following through with the sanctions package. So you have the U.S. continuing to raise pressure on the United Arab Emirates and on Turkey when it comes to exporting goods to Russia. So this does seem now they haven't taken any concrete action, and once again, Turkey is a very much so a secondary power that has the ability to actually influence the outcomes of conflicts. Very strategically significant in terms of geography, and has now become an energy hub. You have the United Arab Emirates, which is a small nation, but still both a massive energy producer and an energy hub in and of itself. And they're both vital if you want to consider the current U.S. strategy of global hegemony. Those are two countries that you're going to need on your side. And once again, they are going down this, I can only describe it as a purity spiral, because these nations have not gone completely with the American agenda in terms of implementing sanctions on Russia. And it does make you question, will the American empire be absurd enough to expand the sanctions to these nations? Now, I think the statistic was something like 48% of the world population is subject to some form of U.S. sanctions, and that's just across the world. But I don't know if the current move is, and I wouldn't be shocked by it, but would reek of a great amount of desperation, be a very uncertain call. Is the move to expand sanctions to countries like Turkey, the UAE, and other nations, like I said, those nations I just listed that are considering joining BRICS, because that is the only way to tighten the noose on Russia? And I mean, it really is at that point, unless you're willing to go full intervention, unless you're willing to blockade the Black Sea, and other Russian ports, that matter, including the ones in the Far East. But at what point do the sanctions expand versus at what point do you give the project? Is it worth bringing down Russia if it means having to implement even more and more sanctions, which will backfire on you? Of course, you can put Europe in front of you as a human shield. You got the Europeans bear the brunt of the sanctions, like we have Germany being outpaced by the Russian economy now, of course, but they can only absorb so much before that actually starts to have ramifications within the U.S. And not only for the people, because of course they are willing to implement the same sort of economic terror they've implemented on the American population since, I would say, at least the 1980s, 1990s, with a lot of the free trade agreements. But at what point does it start to affect the bottom line of the American elites? Because, of course, they can use both the European elites and people as that meat shield. They can use the general U.S. population that meat shield, but how long until their policies actually come back for them? Now, some people may say that's impossible, they're too well guarded, but if just hypothetically to assume they were to go after these countries that violate the sanctions and punish them, once again, that's going to have the ramifications. How long until that actually reaches places like the highest echelons of D.C., Washington, and L.A., Chicago, the major cities? How long until this affects the American elite? I think is the real question.
Right, and that might prompt all kinds of things because, as I said in the last show, like unlike some people in our circles that make videos about why did Putin decide to invade when he did, it makes Putin sound like the protagonist. He really isn't. Um, if the Minsk Accords were respected, he'd go along with them. If there wasn't a coup in Kiev, he, Crimea would be part of Ukraine. But there are certain red lines, and that red line was forced on him beginning at the end of January, exactly this time last year. So I would say with China, China has no plans to invade Taiwan uh, unless unless America feels it's running out of time, and it's looking at forcing China to invade Taiwan because it will, if irreparably lose it out of just Taiwan aligning with openly and formally with the U.S. Because right now they're playing this game, that America respects one China policy, Taiwan is China, so on and so on, but they don't, obviously. So it depends on like whatever America's watch is saying, and they will have to provoke this. I honestly don't know how they're going to do this, right? Like, I feel like America no longer has the capability to invade a country like, let's say, Iraq anymore, right? Remember that Iraq was supposed to be a stepping stone to invade Iran.
They even
They've
had
been
to
in the
call in
they
auxiliaries for the Iraq invasion. They had to have the British and Australian forces on top of a bunch of token Eastern European forces
Right, they're
participate in the
spent.
invasion.
And all this talk about a future war with America and Iran to protect Israel, like that's just nonsense. They're not going to invade. They're going to be reduced to just, air campaigns once in a while to destroy something, to hopefully set the clock back until the time that Iran creates a nuclear missile, et cetera, et cetera. That's all that is. They're not going to invade. They've had 20 years inside Iraq to use it as a beachhead against Iran,
Well, I think
and they
probably
haven't done it.
the biggest argument against war against Iran between the U.S. is that you see increasingly the opinions of American Jews on the topic of Israel
Yeah,
that they view America as their promised land. They view
yeah,
America as that rather than Israel. That Israel could go to hell for all they care. It seems at this point. Now there are some more
and in many ways,
Zionistic ones
America
there,
is a
but
preferable Jewish homeland than Israel.
oh, but yeah, absolutely, they've established that. So it, look, I'm not saying that they wouldn't confront Iran, especially considering the fact Iran has put itself, let's just say, on the wrong end of the American empire, at least from their perspective. But they're not going to do it for the interest of Israel. Netanyahu getting in front of Congress and yammering and running his mouth isn't going to have the same effect as it did even in 2015.
No, definitely
Things have
not. I mean,
changed
he's
so
even
much more since
backtracking
then.
and aiding Ukraine. He
Oh,
just said
absolutely.
to like just a half an hour ago or an hour ago that um, uh, it's not in Israel's interest to help out Ukraine in any more significant way than it has because that would bring problems between it and Russia in Syria, which it said he said he has no interest in starting. So
I mean, I'll put it this way, just to not to stray too far off topic, but if they don't find the most pro-Zionist Republican to push into office in 2024, I'm not saying Israel will cease to exist, but I'm saying Israel as we know it will cease to exist, and that it will become one of many nations. It will no longer be that quote unquote exceptional nation in the Middle East. That it will have to play ball with its neighbors. That it will have to start to come to terms with, say, the Palestinian issue and find some sort of actual solution on that, because a lot less the world is going to be as blindly loyal to Tel Aviv as, say, Washington is, especially under the administration of an ardent Zionist. So I think unless we get a rabid Zionist Republican in office, whoever that may be, I don't know. Maybe it's somebody we've never heard of. Maybe it's some state senator they're going to artificially elevate, similar to what they did with Obama on the Democratic end. But unless that happens, and unless that guy in office decides to go through, gives Israel carte blanche to do whatever on the Palestinian question, and take care of Iran, Israel is going to have to come to some sort of terms with neighbors, or it is actually going to be pushed into the sea.
Yeah, I mean, people have tried to give me alternative, like I was speaking to somebody on Telegram, alternative views on what is happening right now between Iran and America and Israel. Like, understand that the main problem that they have is that Iran is producing drones for Russia. Okay. Uh, Number two, um, the idea that the chess pieces are being put in place and America is going to use the lion's share of its forces to fight in Iran against Iran, while China and Russia continue to develop their own strategies and dominate their own regions, or at least protect their interests in their own regions, first of all, is laughable. And the idea that, oh, the normalization of relations between Arabian Peninsula, Arabic states, and Israel is the first sign. How do you know that's not the first sign of some kind of a tacit agreement that isn't about invading Iran, right? Because Saudi Arabia has not even figured out Yemen yet. The idea
Not to
that it's
mention the
going
same Saudi
to,
Arabia that's
like, it's
also
so preposterous, right?
same Saudi
Like,
Arabia that's also coming to terms with Iran, at least on an on and off basis.
yes, of course. Now, you would have to believe that. That's all like, oh, those are all little games that are being played because you're so smart. You figured out what's going to happen. And they have to be very careful that you won't disclose the secret on your, YouTube channel with 153
Yeah,
subscribers.
yeah.
It's so dumb.
Be careful that the
It's
truth won't get on the war report.
yeah, yeah. It's so dumb. It's so dumb. Like, do you understand? America spent. White boys don't want to die for Israel and you know global homo America. They don't want to die. There's a reason why there's been a 24% drop in recruitment for the Marines, the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force. The Air Force, of
Honestly,
all things.
I think the only thing that could get that again get the white boys back enlisted is if they actually did declare war on the cartels. I think that's the only thing at this point that
Yeah, yeah.
could
And again,
reverse
that's
that
divided
crisis.
America. You think blacks and Hispanics want to fight for Israel? Like, are you crazy?
I mean, let's just put it this way: the ones that aren't politically aware are just that, not politically aware. They don't care. But for the vast majority of, let's just say, POC who are politically aware of foreign policy issues in the United States, view it through the lens that Israel is a colonialist power and we have to stand with the oppressed people of Palestine. You can see this kind of stuff all over. And like I said, I'm not saying that as some sort of like pro-Zionist statement, don't get me wrong. But point being is, the the blacks and the Hispanics who have an understanding of global affairs to any degree are 90% anti-Israel.
Yeah, they are. And it's again, you've got a divided America, and the one side does not want to die in a war for the other side. Of course, we're speaking, by and by, generally speaking, you're going to find outliers, of course. But generally speaking, no, they don't want to die for Israel. And again, they're not dying. You're not. It's not for Israel. It's as much as it is the drone thing. Um, you know, uh, they're probably also afraid that Russia is going to help out Iran develop hypersonic missiles.
Oh,
China,
absolutely.
China has its own hypersonic missiles. Uh, Russia has already given Su-35s and Su-34s. Finally, like, they have modern planes. They have S-300 systems. They will probably get S-400 systems down the road as well. And they're being integrated. Plus, the north-south route from St. Petersburg to Tehran is almost complete, right? That evades anything that NATO or the US can throw at it. So that's what they're afraid of. It's a much bigger question, not because like Iran is going to nuke Israel or some other nonsense.
Yeah, once again, it returns to, and you actually don't even see this that much anymore because it's fallen so much out of favor with the American public. That very Christian Zionist evangelical
Yeah,
eschatology of, well, of course, the final war and the second coming, they're all going to take place around Iran and its war with Israel, and it's going to play coincidentally right into the geopolitical interests of the Zionists. And I mean, even that has decreased because a lot of people who believed that in 2001 were old as it was, and they have, let's just say, gone the way of the dinosaur politely. Or, again, a lot of the people have either just changed their views on those beliefs or abandoned those beliefs altogether to the point where, I mean, I think it was even some sort of opinion poll just in the last few years that came out about
yeah.
support for Israel among various religious groups. I mean, like, even the evangelicals, like, were in, like, the high
Millennial
50s. Like,
evangelicals are less
yeah,
likely to support Israel than their parents.
it's it's a dead issue. It's not coming back. And I think they realize it. I think Netanyahu, of all people, actually does realize it as well. Which is the reason I don't. Which is the exact reason I don't think he's sending arms to Ukraine because he can tell the direction it's going. Now, I'm not saying he's going to align himself with Russia and China and going to completely realign the state of Israel or whatever. By no means. But point being is, he's not going to make those needless provocations in a world where the American empire isn't just at the direct command of Israel as it was for the 15 to 20 years after 9/11.
Right. And let's not forget, some more information has come out of the attack last week when it came about just as we were finishing the show. It was only one explosion. It was from a drone that was launched somewhere in Iran. It was not a sophisticated drone. It had some ammunition attached to it and it dove in. It is not a huge setback for Iran, right? Iran has its own uh, air defense systems in Syria at the moment. Uh, yes, they get hit by U.S. and Israeli jets on a routine basis, but they're not giving up. You know, um, yes, Yemen ships headed for Yemen filled with Kalashnikovs are getting stopped by the U.S., but it hasn't helped Saudi Arabia take care of Yemen either. So the idea that like, especially now when America has these polar interests of Ukraine and Taiwan, that it's going to involve itself in a 2003 style war with Iran is just laughable. It doesn't even have the means. How is it going to have enough means to fight a war against China? How is it even take China out of the equation? How
And this
is
is
it going
talking
to
about an
have enough
Iran that does
to
not have
even fight in
nukes.
in Ukraine?
Imagine an Iran that does have nukes. Completely off the table. No question
Yeah,
about it.
yeah. If you have nukes, you're going to be safe. That's the bottom line.
Yeah, North Korea has proven that, and on the flip side, Libya has also proven that. What happens to a country that denuclearizes? So, with
Yeah.
that being said, actually, we do have a little bit of news on North Korea just to round out some of our Asian news. And this is coming from Lloyd Austin. He had said on the 31st that the U.S. is committed to using conventional and nuclear weapons to deter North Korea and defend South Korea. And according to the Pentagon, in 2022, the DPRK has committed a number of quote unquote unprecedented provocations. And he continued to say, with the U.S., together with South Korea, condemned these dangerous actions, which, according to the parties, destabilize the situation in the region. So it does sound like that, once again, they're priming the pump for some sort of confrontation in East Asia, whether that be with China, whether that be for North Korea. But once again, turning that attention away from Ukraine, away from the other theaters, to Asia, to focus on that because that is what they expect to be the next flashpoint. In which case, it probably will. especially if you believe that document that alleges 2025 is the date that we will likely see some sort of confrontation with China. And the last news I have on the Asian front is a quote from Sergei Lavrov saying that relations between Russia and China are higher in quality than military alliances. They have neither restrictions nor limits. So, once again, you have statements from Lavrov affirming the Russian Chinese relationship. You've had several statements from China doing likewise over the course of the past year. Although China has not, quote unquote, endorsed the invasion, there's really no real possibility of them participating with the sanctions package. You had that canceled meeting, which likely the meeting between Blinken and Xi Jinping would have been, please, Mr. Xi Jinping, accept the sanctions package and help us crush Russia against your own direct interests. So, with that being said, although there was the fear for a time that China would participate in the sanctions package, it does not appear that is going to happen at this point,
Yeah.
especially as the Taiwan question becomes more and more contentious and comes more and more to the forefront, and especially as the U.S. tries to pivot more and more back to Asia, because of course you had the pivot to Asia under Obama Trump, then it snapped right back to Europe with the outbreak of the Ukraine war, and now as they're once again trying to refocus on Asia, you're not going to get China buckling at this time. If
Yeah.
anything, this will steal their resolve and they'll continue forward. And I mean, there's some speculation that they're already aiding the Russian war effort in terms of technological cooperation. Now, I haven't seen any substantial evidence to that,
Uh,
but
I have something.
oh, do tell.
So this is according to the London-based defense think tank Royal United Services Institute, and they believe that imports of microchips from both China and Hong Kong amounted to $2.6 billion between April and November of last year, which is a 30% increase of the previous year. So that might explain why uh, maybe the Americans see no point in visiting China just yet. Um, I mean, it could be that the situation in Ukraine is actually pushing the Americans to be more bellicose with China.
Oh, I would certainly agree with that, and it's caused a situation, especially with the war in Ukraine going less favorably, that they're going to have to take a stronger front on China. Similar to how the failure in Afghanistan forced the U.S. to puff out its chest on the Ukraine issue in order to save face, in order to stand strong with our ally against an aggressive force. They're likewise going to have to do so to maintain whatever shred of confidence they have with South Korea, with Japan, with Taiwan, with the various other powers in the region. I would say, particularly with South Korea and Japan, because although both countries have had their tension with China and have had their very long and complex history with China, you even have, or I don't know if it's changed too drastically in the past 3 years, but before COVID, I remember one of the main pieces of news out of East Asia was the increasing trade relationship between China and Japan. And although the situation may become more bellicose there, it may become more belligerent there, they are still very economically intertwined countries. And you recall, if Turkey can flip like it did, although Japan is under a U.S. occupation, it's much less stringent than the German occupation. There still is the possibility of Japan playing that in between role. I mean, Japan's still importing Russian oil, they're still continuing energy cooperation with Russia. Although American control is tight there, it's far from as tight as it used to be or far from as tight as it can be. So I think Japan's the real wild card when it comes to East Asia, when it comes
Mm-hmm.
to the relations with that, because although conventionally one would say they're on the American side, I wouldn't be too sure about that in the long term.
Yeah. Yeah, there's we've touched upon Sakhalin Island and the the energy resources there, the projects that they're working with the Russians on. That hasn't gone away. They're taking imports from there. Um, the fact of the matter is America does not have enough um, energy resources to supply Japan, and it's a move that I think even the Americans have to understand. What happens later, I don't know. Um, but I think what worries the Americans is not just the ability of Russia maybe to give military aid to China in case of a conflict over Taiwan, but also the valuable energy resources that are going to be necessary. Because as we've seen, like energy is very important in Ukraine, for instance. Some of the troop movements now have been slowed down significantly because Russia is targeting thermal plants, is targeting the energy sector of Ukraine. I'm not saying that electric trains are like a big thing in Japan, or saying I even know whether that's the case or not. But mechanized warfare requires a lot of energy, and if a country is not rich in energy resources, it will always have to have good trading relations to get them
And
in order
of
to stay technologically advanced.
and of course, Japan's another country that did decommission its nuclear plants in the
Yeah,
wake of Fukushima, being the victim country of that. And not to
yeah,
mention, as I hammer home every time with the question of nuclear energy, yes, I concede it's a very great and efficient energy resource that uh, the possibility of something going wrong is low. Yes, all those concessions out of the way, but that does not avoid the key problem that in order to manufacture most industrial products, you need petroleum products and you need oil. Independent
mm,
of use for as an energy resource, you need those just as raw materials for the basis of your manufacturing economy. It's just the way it is. And hell, you
yeah,
even need those to manufacture the equipment that you use to mine the uranium to fuel your nuclear power plants, and you need petroleum products to even build your nuclear power plants. So just to hammer that point home one last time, that even when it comes to that, of course, Japan is going to be very reliant on outside oil and natural gas because they're still vital parts of any industrial economy. Now,
mm,
if they go the route of Germany and are systematically deindustrialized like Germany and much of Europe at this point, perhaps that's a different question. But for the time being, energy cooperation with a country like Russia is vital.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, you take as long as we're talking about industry, in 1 year or in 11 months, 10 and a half months, Ukraine went through 10 years supply and 5 years supply of Stingers and Javelins. Just think about that.
It does make you question how they define year supply in the face of an actual mechanized, fully industrialized war in the 21st century. That's, I think, one of the most interesting developments of Ukraine. But that's all I had for this episode. If you have any final things, of course, now would be the time.
Uh, no, other than that, I don't. The only other sort of, minutia about industrial capacity and all that is um, apparently there's a discrepancy between the $27 billion that US has allocated for the military and why some of it has, very little of it has actually gone into production itself. I don't pretend to know why that is. I don't know if Ukraine has anything to do with it or if it's just corruption in the US.
Well,
I
well, that
I
is
simply don't know.
that is interesting, but news that is not shocking in the slightest, and I can only chalk that up to both probably the issue of Ukraine and the inefficiency and corruption of the U.S. military establishment, especially when it comes to the bureaucratic wing of that. But that's all we had for this week of the War Report. Thank you, everyone, for tuning into this very interesting episode. I think we covered a lot of ground here, and we look forward to seeing you next week. And goodbye.
Thank you and take care.